Hello, in this video clip we discuss the monopoly. Yet, before looking at the monopoly itself, it is useful to discuss the perfectly competitive market and the firm's decision process in a perfectly competitive market. The perfectly competitive market can be summarized in terms of assumptions as follows. We assume that there are many firms in the market, and I will denote the number of firms by lowercase n. We also assume that all the producers produce the very same good. That is, the good produced in this market is homogeneous. We also assume that sellers and buyers are perfectly informed. This means that buyers are aware of the price asked by the different producers. So it is possible for the buyers to compare all the available sellers' prices, and then they can make a choice of buying from the cheapest producer. And finally, a key assumption is that because we have many firms in the market, a single firm's output will never be large enough so that any change in that firm's output would affect the market price. That is, the market price cannot be influenced by a single firm, so the market price will be given as an exogenous external factor to the firm. Also, in order to establish link between the whole market and the firm's decision, we will assume that all firms are similar, so they have the same marginal cost and total cost functions. We start with a graphical representation of the goods market. Here we have a supply and a demand, and we know that in equilibrium we will have a price P star. This price P star is going to be given to the firm, so the firm will not be able to affect the price. That's the reason why when you look at the individual firm's decision, which is the graph on the right hand side, then the marginal revenue or the price curve is just going to be a horizontal line. That is, whatever lowercase q output is chosen by the firm, it will always face the same market price. And of course, by knowing the marginal cost and the marginal revenue curves, we can already choose the profit maximizing output for the firm. And because there are n firms in the market, we can see that uppercase Q star, that is the equilibrium quantity in the market, is going to be n times the individual firm's output. Now we look at the monopoly. In case of a monopoly, there is a single seller in the market. A consequence of this is that the quantity produced by the monopolist will equal the total supply in the market, and the monopoly will face the whole demand in the market. As a result, we do not need to use two graphs anymore, but a single graph, the graph of the whole market, will be sufficient. It is important to bear in mind what really monopoly means. Monopoly means an absolute market power. If you remember, in a perfectly competitive market, firms had no market power, which meant that they could not affect the price at all. Absolute market power means that by choosing the quantity produced, the market price can be set by the monopolist. So the monopoly will have an absolute power in deciding the price of the good. This relationship between the market price and the quantity produced is represented by the inverse demand function, which is here shown as a blue line. So let us look at the decision process. The total revenue is going to be still the market price times the quantity, with one major difference, namely that the price that can be charged for a unit of good is going to depend on the total output, which equals the output of the monopoly. So the P of Q is nothing else than the inverse demand function. So the relationship, as I told you earlier, between the market price and the output is represented by the inverse demand curve. The average revenue will coincide with this demand curve. You can see that simply by dividing the total revenue by Q, we just get the price. Price at different levels of Q. So this is nothing else than the inverse demand function. Where there is a big difference between the monopoly and a firm operating in a perfectly competitive market is that the marginal revenue will not coincide with the demand curve. Using the rule for the derivatives of products, which you can see in the upper right corner of this slide, we can express the marginal revenue from the total revenue. So the marginal revenue will be first the inverse demand curve plus a quantity which is nothing else than the first derivative of the inverse demand function with respect to the quantity produced times the quantity produced. So this is actually very similar to an elasticity, even though it is not exactly an elasticity. But the point is, you can see that because the relationship between the quantity and the price is negative, this derivative, this dP of Q, derivative with respect to Q is going to be a negative number. Because Q is also either 0 or a positive number, it is already visible that the marginal revenue curve must always be below the demand curve. They are only taking the same value if Q equals 0. This means that we should draw the marginal revenue in case of a monopoly as a steeper, negatively sloped line. You can also understand the concept of market power as a rotation of the marginal revenue curve. When we had a perfectly competitive market, then the average revenue was equal to the marginal revenue. So the two curves coincided. As the firm's market power increases and the firm can affect the price in the market, the marginal revenue curve starts to rotate downwards or to the left, if you like. The maximum possible rotation is reached in case of a monopoly, because this is the point where, instead of influencing the prices, the firm can determine exactly what the price in the market is. Now we look at the monopolist's choice. The monopolist is going to use the same profit maximum condition as a perfectly competitive firm. That is, the profit maximizing output is where the marginal revenue equals marginal cost. You may wonder how comes that the same condition can be applied to monopoly and perfectly competitive firm. The reason is that when we derived the profit maximum condition, we did not assume anything about the market structure. That means that this profit maximum condition is a general condition and will be the same for different market structures. The basic idea was to define profit as the difference between total revenue and total cost. In order to find the output which maximizes the profit, we just simply used calculus. We took the first difference of the profit function with respect to quantity and we set it equal to 0. That level of Q for which this condition was true had to be the profit maximizing quantity. Using this way of thinking together with the graph from the previous slide, now we can see that the monopolist is going to choose to produce QM quantity of the good. And because for this quantity to be sold in the market, the monopolist can charge a price of PM that is going to be the market price. So once the quantity is chosen by the firm, and that depended on the shape of the demand curve and the structure of the cost, then the market price was set immediately. An interesting consequence of this is that the monopolists do not have a supply curve, because as you can see, the monopolist is going to choose just a single point along the demand curve. Another interesting concept is the markup. If you look at this graph, then you can observe that at QM production level, the monopolist will be able to charge a higher price than its marginal cost. If you remember, in case of a perfectly competitive firm, the firm was not able to charge a higher price than the marginal cost. Here, however, this is not true anymore, which gives rise to an economic profit. So the markup is going to be the difference between the market price and the marginal cost. This is also a measure of market power. That is a measure of the ability of the firm to affect the market price. For a perfectly competitive market, the markup is zero, and the largest possible markup is for a monopoly.